Okay, good evening to both of you. I think until others join, we can slowly go ahead and start today's class. And in the previous weeks, we were discussing about the basics of research, and we discussed about some of the fundamentals, the differences between qualitative research, quantitative research, and also last week, not the last week, I think the week before that, we were discussing about ways of knowing how people get to know things, and from there exactly we discuss about the scientific method. Now, before we go ahead and discuss about different types of research, for example correlational research, experimental research, and all of that, I shared three presentations today, one on research questions, one on measurements, and one on ethics. So I thought it's better if we can actually have a discussion on those first and understand more about some of the little remaining basics of research, so that we'll be ready pretty much to have a discussion about experimental research. Now, give me a second. I'm going to share my screen here. So let's start today's discussion with research questions. Now, whenever you want to do a research, one of the very first things that you need to make sure you have is an appropriate research question. Without having a proper research question, it is very difficult to go ahead and do a research. Now, when you think about research, one of the very first things I need to tell you is research always tries to address a problem. Okay? Whenever you think about research, you think about a specific problem because we will be finding an answer to a problem. So if that's the case, in research, when we write a research report or research paper or thesis, anything for that matter, there needs to be a proper research question. So the research problem or the resulting research question is one of the starting points in research. Now, in this lecture, we will be discussing about the method to come up with a research idea and also qualities of a good research question. Now, truth be told, sometimes it is very difficult to come up with a good research idea. Even though we know things about a specific field, for example, let's say now we are in the field of psychology, but even when I was told the first time to develop a research or do a research for one of my MScs, it was slightly difficult for me at that time. The main reason was I have some theoretical understanding, but even though I have theoretical understanding, from there, how to identify a problem was slightly difficult. But then again, there were students, other colleagues, who were able to come up with research ideas rather quickly. So for some people, they have always been trying to figure out an answer for something. So the moment they are told, okay, go ahead and do a research, they can come up with some idea. They can come up with a good research problem, but not everyone can. So if we cannot come up with the proper research question, then we need to follow a specific method. And by following this method, we can come up with a good research question. So most of the times, my recommendation is to try to find a practical problem. Practical problem in the society, it could be anything. Now, let me give you an example. Now, these days, there's a huge amount of people are concerned about ice usage, ice, the drug usage. So these kind of drug usage could have a lot of negative outcomes. But do we have enough research about it in Sri Lanka right now? No, because this is a present trend. It's been happening now. So that's a real problem. You can identify such a problem and then you can start researching from that problem. Okay, because we need to find an answer for it. Okay, what are the consequences of using this particular drug? How does it affect families? How does it affect the society? How does it affect the education system? And so on and so on. So different researchers can research about different aspects. But this is the problem. So this problem is located first. So whenever you want to do a research, the very first thing that you have to do is locating a problem that can actually be addressed. A researchable problem. It could be anything. It could be related to drug abuse. It could be related to HR. Anything, as long as there is a uh, problem that can be documented. Okay. So that is the first thing that you have to do. And then you have to understand your research area. Now, once you identify this particular research, what do you call the problem, you need to read existing research papers as much as possible. Now, if you are doing research about drug addiction, for example, since we talked about the ice drug, you have to spend significant amount of time trying to find information about this particular area. Like, for instance, what is this ice drug? Has it been reported in Sri Lankan literature? When was it first reported in Sri Lanka? What are the current trends of this particular drug? Do you think a lot of kids use it these days? If kids use, what are the age ranges? What are the consequences they have reported so far? What do these health authorities say about the usage of this drug? So you have to go ahead and read this existing literature to understand what exactly is happening in this area right now. We do have a problem, but just because we have a problem doesn't mean we can just go ahead and do a research. We have to review all the literature right now. Whatever the literature that is available, we have to go through and we have to understand, and then only once we understand, okay, there has been some prevalence of this particular drug use. At the same time, some research has already been conducted. A few other research areas are being proposed. So this is exactly what we are going to do. So we can logically build it up when we know this information. So technically, you have to become a mini expert in this particular area of interest. So if you become an expert in this particular area of research that you are interested in, then you can push yourself more and more and go ahead and do better research. So finding journal articles is very important. Now, I think on our first day, we discussed about a few databases. And even if you don't have such a database, through Google also you can find good research papers. And once you find these research papers, you can read them to understand where exactly the identified problem is going. And previous research papers also provide good ideas of future research. So, for example, let's say a group of researchers have conducted the study in 2022 November. So they also have reviewed then the most contemporary literature, and they may have provided some feedback or recommendations as to what somebody has to do if they need to continue this research. So then you can consider those information as well. Now, this is how we develop our entire research ideas and research questions and all of that. So one of the first things that you had to do when you do this is you had to have an open mind, because we are not forming any judgment about anything. We know there's a problem, but we don't expect a specific answer. We just go ahead and review literature to see where exactly it takes us. Based on that, you can make an informed decision about the research question that you want to come up with. So, and the other thing is you can always talk to specialists in the field. For example, your lecturers, maybe your even friends. Sometimes your friends are not interested in drug addiction, but then again, they may have some expertise in the area. For example, you may have a friend who works in an addictions clinic. So then they also have some expert opinion about what you will be studying. So the more you talk, the more you engage, the more you take the discussion forward, the easier it is for you to come up with a good research question. Now, with the research question that we discussed, let's try to build this a little bit more. Now, in research, there is something called the conceptual diagram. Now, last week I discussed about variables with you. Now, in a research study, what we basically do is we come up with a set of variables. And we demonstrate some relationships between these variables so that we can later test them. So based on the method you draw these, you can conduct different statistical analysis. So about statistical analysis and all of that, we'll discuss later. But I just want to show you how exactly a research can be developed. Now, all these things has to go simultaneously. Now, we could have just discussed research questions and later think about the conceptual diagram as well. But I think it will be very important and pretty good if we can focus on all of this simultaneously, because when a person thinks of research, they have to come up with all of this at the same time. Now, let's try to understand this here. Now, this is something that I developed with some of my students in a different university. Now here, this is what we call a conceptual diagram. A conceptual diagram pretty much demonstrates what the research is going to study. Now let's try to understand this conceptual diagram. Here it says financial threat. Here we have another one, self-efficacy. And here we have another one called psychological disturbance. Now here I have three objectives. I have three research questions. I have written only one here, but I have three research questions. Now let's try to understand what this diagram exactly says. Financial threat, if you look at this, I have included this financial threat within a circle, and from here there's an arrow that goes from left to right to psychological disturbance. So what this pretty much says is financial threat affects or influences or has some relationship with psychological disturbance. So if you have so much of loans, if you are struggling to pay your car lease, if you don't have enough money to eat, does it make us feel bad? Absolutely yes. It makes us feel really bad and upset about ourselves. So yes, financial threat has some impact on psychological disturbance. And at the same time here, this particular researcher has also demonstrated that financial threat has something to do with self-efficacy. So self-efficacy means the degree to which you believe in yourself. Sometimes when you don't have money, you don't really believe in yourself. I will believe in myself if I have good money. If I don't have money, I will sometimes doubt my capacity to do things. And once again, self-efficacy impacts psychological disturbance. So if I don't believe in myself, again, I will have a difficult time, psychologically speaking. Now, these are the three variables: financial threat, self efficacy, and psychological disturbance. Now, the researcher, based on the theoretical understanding he or she has, the researcher has placed them in a particular way where it will demonstrate certain relationships. See, financial threat has something to do with disturbance. Financial threat has to do with has something to do with efficacy, and efficacy has something to do with psychological disturbance. Now, this is exactly what he or she would want to go ahead and do in this particular research. Now, whenever you think about a research, probably you will have some idea like this. And always start by visually thinking about your research. Before you start to write these titles and all of that, just try to visualize this. So start with the conceptual diagram. So basically, your idea, put it on a paper, but in a visually appealing way, so that you can actually see what is happening in your research. Now, we came up with this idea because recently Sri Lanka went through hyperinflation stage, and because of this, a lot of people lost quite a lot of money. The value that your money had once was definitely lost. At the same time, the bank loan interest, lease interest, and all of these things became super high as well. So right now, for many people, it's very difficult to live. So then we wanted to understand, okay, what exactly is happening when people go through this kind of threats? Yes, people feel really upset. But as a researcher, I think it's not just the financial threat. The financial threat could affect efficacy, and efficacy in return could, affect the psychological status of a person. So we have demonstrated this using this particular conceptual diagram. And you could add different other ones here as well. Not just self-efficacy, maybe it affects someone's self-esteem as well. So if you think it affects self-esteem, then you can draw another circle where it says, yes, a financial threat could impact somebody's self-esteem, and that self-esteem could impact that person's psychological disturbance, because self-esteem is the value that you place on yourself. And if I don't have any money, sometimes I might see myself in a very depreciative way. That's a possibility. Now, based on this, if you notice here, I have written H1, H2, and H3. See, if you just go through this, it says, you see, H1. This H1 means hypothesis 1. Can you remember last time I told a hypothesis is a tentative testable prediction? So I haven't still done this research, but at this stage, I am predicting, or rather I am planning on testing whether financial threat has something to do with psychological disturbance. And this is my first prediction. I'm saying, okay, look, I think these two are related. So I right next to this particular arrow, I write H1. And this 1 is written as a subscript. This X2 button here, right here, this is the subscript. So H1, hypothesis 1, it says financial threat has something to do with psychological disturbance. Now, very similar to that, I have another arrow. So this arrow I will name as H2. Hypothesis 2, I am interested in finding whether financial threat could have something to do with self-efficacy of a person. And also whether self-efficacy has something to do with psychological disturbance, which I have named as H3. Now, overall, I have 3 objectives for my study. What are my objectives? First one is to investigate the relationship between financial threat and psychological disturbance. The second one is to investigate the relationship between financial threat and self-efficacy. And the third is to investigate the relationship between self-efficacy and psychological disturbance. You get what I'm saying? So we initially developed this. We just placed our variables. And then we spend time thinking, okay, in which direction we need to draw our arrows, where exactly these variables come and go. So we did that. And then each line represents a hypothesis. So once we put up H1, H2, H3, and all of that, everything else will come in order, because then you have objectives. Objective pretty much is like a hypothesis. So where you would say, okay, I want to investigate the relationship between financial threat and psychological disturbance. That's the objective. Objective means something that you want to do in your study. Now, once you have your objectives, these objectives can be converted to research questions. We were talking about research questions. So what is a research question then? See, RQ1, research question 1, is there a relationship between financial threat and psychological disturbance? So I could tell someone, okay, if someone asks me, what are you planning on studying? What are your research questions? I would tell them, well, my research question 1 is there a relationship between financial threat and psychological disturbance? This research question has resulted from my first objective. I have one objective. So to find that objective, I had to have a question. So that is my question. And then research question 2 then, let's type that out as well. Is there a relationship between financial threat and self-efficacy? So that has derived from my second objective. And then now I have a third research question as well. Is there a relationship between self-efficacy and psychological disturbance? So these are our research questions. Now see the consistency here. This is super consistent. It all starts from this diagram, and I have 3 objectives. three research questions, and we can now develop hypotheses for the same as well. Now let's develop our hypotheses. So if we learn how to develop hypotheses right now, it will be very easy. So let's do that. So I'll take this box right here. Okay, I'm going to remove this and I'm going to write it as hypothesis. Okay, here, if it is singular, it would be hypothesis like this. Now, since we have multiple, I'm going to write it like this, hypothesis. So this is the plural. Now, let's try to understand the method of writing hypothesis. It's very easy to write a hypothesis if we know the right method. Okay, first focus on this H1. That is our first hypothesis. Okay, so I'm going to write H1. And then I am going to make this one look smaller by clicking on this subscript option. Now it would look like this. Okay, my objective was to investigate the relationship between financial threat and psychological disturbance. Now I am going to word it a little bit different here. You can say financial threat and psychological disturbance has a significant relationship. Now, one could ask, why do I put the word significant? In quantitative research, you have to run a statistical analysis to see whether they are significant or not. So still we haven't discussed about statistical analysis, but still when we write our hypothesis, let's remember the word significant has to be included. You can say financial threat and psychological disturbance has a significant relationship. If not, you could say it has a statistically significant relationship. Let me write it like that because then that is even further better. Okay, statistically significant relationship. Now let's do the same one for our second hypothesis, H2. Okay. Financial threat and self-efficacy has a statistically significant relationship. And let's do it for the third one as well, H3. Okay, now this one is self-efficacy and psychological disturbance has a statistically significant relationship. Okay. See now, all of this we have gathered from this very, slide itself. Everything that we want to do our research is right here. Okay, now the big question comes. Now I have objectives, I have research questions, I have hypotheses, I have a conceptual diagram and all of that as well. But how am I going to measure and how am I going to collect my data? Now this is the research, no? But I need to approach people and get data. Now in a research like this, if we are to go ahead and get data, what we psychologists usually do is we hand out scales. Scales means, these are questionnaires. So the nature of these questionnaires we'll discuss a little bit later, but it's kind of like a survey. We give some questions for our audience or the participants. They fill these things up. Once they fill these things up, I can generate a score for each person, and I will use that final score in aggregate to understand what exactly is happening here. Now, financial threat can be assessed by the financial threat scale. So basically a set of questions, I'll hand it over to my audience or my participants and they will rate it. And once they rate it, I have a score, like how much of perceived threat a person has. Okay, so financial threat can be assessed through financial threat scale. And then uh, psychological disturbance. Now, psychological disturbance is a bit of a vague term. It's like saying, I am not in the mood today. When you say someone that I am not in the mood today, it could mean a lot of things. Maybe you had a good mood yesterday, but not today. Or maybe your mood is bad, but not in the worst possible situation, most possible uh, the state that one could ever imagine. And when you say that your mood is not good, it's very difficult for people to understand what exactly you would say. They might know that you are not good or your mood is out, but then again, we don't know. So psychological disturbance is something like that. It's not specific, it's a bit vague. So we had to come up with a scale to measure this. Now I have given multiple scales here. For example, Warwick Edinburgh mental well-being scale. You can measure well-being of a person, mental well-being, to understand psychological disturbance. If not, you can measure depression, anxiety, stress in a person to measure psychological disturbance. And there are some other scales as well. So depending on your interest, you can come up with a scale to measure this. And then generalized self-efficacy scale for self-efficacy. So these are essentially constructs. Can you remember when I told about hypotheses, that hypotheses are developed from constructs? So financial threat, self-efficacy, and psychological disturbance pretty much are psychological constructs. We make them variables by introducing a method to measure them. This introduction of a method to measure them is a process called an operational definition or operationalization. Okay, let me write it here. Okay, give me a second. Okay, operationalization. Operationalization means converting a construct to a variable, a measurable variable, actually, not just a variable, but a measurable variable. A measurable variable. Okay, right, like this. So this is exactly what is happening. So it might, you might kind of feel like there's too much of terminology here, but that's usually the drill, you know, when you study research. When we start, there will be some terminology, but after some time, it all becomes very normal. It all becomes very normal. And technically speaking, when you study for the first time, you don't need to have all of this. But the reason why I'm introducing this is your life will be much more easier when you actually start to think about research like this. Then you have a visual understanding about what your research is going to be. You have your objectives nicely written. You have your research questions nicely written. You have your hypothesis nicely written. You know how to operationalize. So some of the fundamental information to go ahead and start your research is already available here in this little slide. So the rest is to actually go ahead and develop your research report, like how to develop a research report. We'll discuss in our future classes. But this is very important information, how to go ahead and develop your research. So I have actually given them in the next slide as well. Objectives, research questions, and hypotheses. So this is how you would generate hypothesis. So you start with this diagram, and then you go to the next level and you try to see whether they are all consistent. See, my research question to hypothesis one and to objectives, all of them are very consistent. The same objective is converted to a research question and converted to a hypothesis. Okay. So you will notice that I have written a H1 and a H0 as well. Now, there are two different types of hypotheses. Now here I haven't actually included them, but let me write it here. There are two different types of hypotheses called null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. Null hypothesis usually say there is no relationship. Alternative hypothesis always say that there is a relationship. Now, what we have written here, H1, H2, H3, these are all alternative hypotheses. If by any chance, if the data that you have collected suggests there is no relationship, then, for example, let's say H1, you found that there is no relationship, then you have to reject this hypothesis. So when you reject this hypothesis, you will be accepting the null hypothesis of this H1. So there needs to be a H01. That is the null hypothesis, where it says financial threat and psychological disturbance has no statistically significant relationship. Depending on your data, if your data supports it, you accept this hypothesis. If your data doesn't support, then you have to reject this hypothesis and accept the null hypothesis. We'll spend some more time with hypotheses so that you would learn how to exactly come up with these alternative hypotheses and null hypotheses. So here I have done a demonstration. There is no statistically significant relationship. There is a statistically significant relationship. So this is H0, this is H1. Now, very similar to that, here you have H2. For this also, you can write a null hypothesis. For example, H02, then we have to make this H01 just to make it consistent. I will keep it like this for the moment. And then H2, so here you could say there is a statistically significant relationship between financial threat and self-efficacy. So please come up, you can come up with the null hypothesis for this one as well. And then here you have the third one. And then for this also you can come up with a null hypothesis. Now, when you write a research, it's not very important to list your null hypothesis because the objective is to support the alternative. So you may just keep your alternative hypothesis. But by any chance, if this is rejected, when you reject, what it means is you reject the alternative hypothesis, but you accept your null hypothesis. And you can pretty much write it like this as well. So this is once again a research question. And in some research, the research question can be substituted with the hypothesis. Now, there are two types of hypotheses named directional hypothesis and non-directional hypothesis. So the directional and the non-directional hypothesis, I am not going to discuss it today because it will be slightly confusing if I just jump from all of this to this today itself. So we can take some more time and later discuss once we go through a little bit of statistical analysis, we can discuss about this. Okay. But now, since we have some understanding about research questions, let's try to see what are some common good practices for a good research question. Every time you develop a research question, make sure it is of interest. You really like this particular question that you want to find, and it aligns with some theory. Everything that we do in psychological research, it has to align with the theory, like social cognitive theory, humanistic theories, other forms of biopsychosocial models, and whatnot. And your research question should have some form of impact as well. And it has to be original in some aspect. We can't just go ahead and repetitively do some other research that people have already done. We have to add something new to the knowledge base. And it has to be feasible. So when you think about research, think about research that actually can be completed or done without necessarily saying later that, look, I did the research, but it's very difficult to do. Or I did develop a proposal, but it's very difficult to do. And then remove all unnecessary information and try to write the research question in less words, 25 or less words. Titles must be 12 or less. Question also you can try to, make it really concise. And any person who reads this should be able to read and understand. Of course, now there are some technical words people might not be able to understand, but mostly we have to make sure that when people read this, they can read and understand. Now, this is the criteria for a good research question.